I'd like to give a quick history lesson, if I could. This is to form some kind of background. Sometime, it must have been around 1976, the McLuhan program was starting up, and there was, Marshall McLuhan would hold court there with a bunch of disciples, and one of those people was a man named Richard Hill. And Richard Hill was an ad man, advertising guy, and he fell under the spell of McLuhan, and he then took it further with his own ideas. And Richard could see that there was an oncoming merging between the television, telephone, and computer technologies, which we're all very familiar with these days. But in those days, in 76, 77, that was considered very unlikely. But Richard then, the story goes, at a cocktail party, ran into a guy named Roy Ascott. And Roy Ascott was then president of Ontario College of Art and Design. And he convinced Ascott that what the college desperately needed was a department that dealt with new technologies. And Ascott agreed, and so the photoelectric arts department was formed. And these people here are among the first students at that department. It was a very close group because the rest of the college just didn't believe that computers had any part in a creative endeavor. So we would go to building and property meetings and try to eke a few dollars out to buy another computer or some equipment, and would run into tons of resistance from all the other departments. But because we're all working together so closely, supporting each other, to this day, I have this summer mill party, and people from those early days still show up. We've become a community that is like very tightly knit. And people would say, well, what good is this knowledge that you're accumulating? What is it good for? And the time has shown that these people who were students went off in many, many different directions. They didn't all become web designers or anything like that. Some became musicians, some became installation artists, some became curators, some became executives. A guy named Chris Hinton became high-end executive in Apple computers. Other people got into manufacturing, other people got into graphics. So what we always preached was you write your own job description. What do you want to do? This technology is so malleable. It can be applied to many, many different endeavors. And that's more or less what happened. So that's a little bit of history. If anybody has any questions, want to jump in, please raise your hand. We'd love to get feedback from you guys as well.
The department that you formed, or the group, is called the Photoelectric Art Department?
Yes.
Does it still exist?
No, they kept changing names on us. It became the New Media Department, and now I think it's the Integrated Media, something like that. I'm not sure. I taught at OCAD up until 2003, and that's when I turned 65, and they said, okay, Norm, you're too old to teach now. And so I lost touch with OCAD, but went on to Ryerson for teaching there for 13 years.
So if I could interject for a second, Norm.
Pardon me?
If I could interject for a second.
Yeah.
Because I still teach at OCAD. And the other day I had a faculty member come into my class. He's an American graduate from University in Florida. He's just got recruited. He's come up to OCAD. He's teaching at OCAD. He's been there for about 2 years. And he said, the most important person that he knows of in the whole Canadian art scene is Norman White, who used to teach at this school. You students are so lucky to be, coming up through the same ranks that Norman White. Just to let you know that your reverberation, your reputation within OCAD still remains gigantic.
Wow, I couldn't
Yes,
expect that.
we are lucky.
Even though I would tell my students, look, what I'm about to teach you is going to make you a misfit. because you will learn all sorts of computer and electronic technology, but because you don't have a formal engineering paper when you leave, nobody's going to believe you. You're going to have to take this technology and apply it in your own terms, and it's going to make your life in a way kind of miserable.
But you also said that why don't you specialize in something that no one else specializes in, and then you're guaranteed a job.
That's
Right?
I was all for cross-fertilizing. My brother, Bob, he took a course in psychology, graduated in the United States with a degree in psychology, and then he was sent to Vietnam, and when he got back from Vietnam, they had a free college education waiting for him, so he went to forestry, he took a degree in forestry management. You know, I said, what does psychology have to do with forestry management? He merged those two disciplines and started a new group of people who are working with the national forests, like how do you maximize the use of the forest and bring people the experience of the national forest without wrecking the forest in the process. So this kind of resource management became his specialty. And so that is what I'm talking about, cross-fertilizing two very dissimilar disciplines. I'm sure people here know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm sure many of you have done the same.
One of the things that sort of I led into after I graduated from OCAD is I started a festival called Subtle Technologies that does that exactly. It brings artists and scientists together. And I think that's something that is really interesting to think about is, you know, you may put something in a pigeonhole and think you only belong there, but you actually, when you bring people together, you start to see how there are these similarities that people don't actually think about. I mean, scientists and artists are both explorers, both trying to describe the world in their own ways. And I think so what Norman was talking about is really important, that idea of getting people together. They don't normally get together, or bringing ideas together, which is what I think that department was all about. I was surprised when I went to OCAD. My background is a bit different, and I started out as an engineer, electronics engineer, worked as an engineer for a few years, got bored of that and wanted to go to art school. So I went to art school and found out, wow, I could actually use some of my engineering to create art, which was amazing. One of the first things I did was take this course on servo motors, on how to control motors. It's like, wow, this is art. So and these are all things that Norm put into place there, which were really, really exciting to me, and I think
You should talk about your conferences a little bit, Jim.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's still going on. It's been going on 20 years now, this conference, this festival of subtle technologies. And we always, every year the idea is to have a different theme. So one year it could be light. So we'd have artists that work on aspects of light, have some kind of practice that works with light. And at the same time, we'll have scientists there who use light in their work in some way, whether it be lasers or astronomy. And then bring these people together and just have discussions and explore ideas around the confluence of these things. So,
in case you missed it, subtle technology.
Subtle technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Subtle technologies.
I always wanted to go.
Yeah.
And that's in Toronto.
And that's in Toronto. Yeah. So.
Wasn't there recently one that was also addressed agriculture?
Yeah. Last one was agriculture and food. That's right. So all kinds of different ideas. I mean, yeah.
When you bring different people together from different disciplines, do you find you have to find a common language first before you can really?
Yeah, I mean that's one of
happen?
the hardest part of my job is running that festival was to get scientists to come the festival, because they have a very different language, like you say, than artists. Mm-hmm. And it was like pulling teeth trying to go into a lab and convincing the scientists, you got to come to this thing, you'll really, really love it, you'll really love it. And eventually it's hard to get them there, but once they get there, they do start to see the common language that both have. Like I say, they're very curious. Scientists are curious, artists are curious. So on the first day, the scientist will come with his tie and be all like proper and get up to the lectern with his briefcase. By the end of it, they've thrown off the tie and they're dancing and having fun at the parties and things. So I think there is a language barrier, definitely, and that is one of the hardest things to deal with. But we're all people, and scientists, artists especially. There's so much in common. So.
And didn't you start in the sciences, Norman? Didn't you start in the sciences?
I started as a biologist, but I realized early on that I'd be a bad biologist. But I was very grateful for having taken biology because it gave me all sorts of visions of creatures squirming under the microscope and whatever that informed my art later on. But so I really think art school should have a large component of biology as a here's a nature that has been doing information storing and information transfer and replication and self-healing, all those things that we're investigating now with modern computers, nature's been doing for millennia. So it's really a great source of inspiration and to have recourse to biology.
Are those amoebas that make you want to wash your hands?
No.
So Norman got his BA in biology at Harvard College, Harvard, and he spent a little bit of, and he is also studying art there at the same time, and he, in studying biology, of course, one of the things you do is you're cutting things up, you're dissecting frogs, I guess, and you're trying to find out about life by cutting it up, and he realized at a certain point that wasn't the way to find out what life is all about. The way to find out what life is all about is to somehow rather than cut things down, was to build things up. And so he got into electronics. He's self-taught digital electronics creator, and then he went from that into robotics and in a number of other directions. But the idea was always to find out ways of emulating life with electronics in one way or another, to try to create a machine or a device that somehow seems to have some sort of a life to it. So that's where he went from biology initially toward in the direction that he is.
But
going
also
now.
not to be a victim of someone else's rules, because the scientists had these ideas of what the results should be, and you are just a pawn, right, like in that process, which Norm learned, right?
Right.
You should talk more about yourself,
Yeah.
Sandor.
Sandor,
Oh, there we go.
Sandor had a show at Durham, if you recall, and he was also sent to Europe as an artist in residence through United Media Arts, also from Durham.
It was a lovely experience.
And well, talk a little bit about your work, because I mean, if you, I don't know if anyone remembers the show. There were. What sense? I think with the introduction of electronic arts, there's also the moment of interactivity, that the quality of how a visitor to a gallery engages with the artwork changed. So the tradition, traditionally it's like you stand there and you look at it. You're not supposed to touch anything. Here comes the invitation to touch. And so touch became something really important, yeah? Mm-hmm. Anyway, talk about your work.
Well, so there I was at OCA in Norman's classes, and once I found out about Norman and the photoelectric arts department, I was very excited. I'd found my niche, and so I started diligently taking classes, and then we'd have parties at the warehouse that I lived in, and one of those parties, I remember Norman was at the party, and I was able to show him that I had actually built, with a lot of help from Norman and others, because you have to really ask questions in order to learn enough to do what I'd done, which was I built a little computer on a little board. It's only like that big. It was very small, and all it could do was flash lights in a certain sequence. It was running a very simple program, but I'd done it all by myself, and I was very excited about that. So it was. I can really say that it was through the photoelectric arts department, and specifically Norman White as a sort of a mentor and a person helping me, even after I left art school. I learned how to build these little computer circuits that I could incorporate into art. And then I got into interactivity, as you were saying, Ilse, and the idea being that you've got buttons and dials, and then an audience member can actually interact with a sculpture. So you've got the sculpture there, and it's got the computer in it, and it's plugged into the wall, and it makes sounds and has flashing lights, but then you can interact, so that as a viewer, someone like yourselves would come into the gallery, and then there's this interplay between the viewer and the work of art, and hopefully there's enjoyment, I guess, as well. So then, yes, as Ilse was saying, one of the high points in my art career, I was offered a residency in Austria at a little town called Krems, and in fact, Gordon Monahan has also had a residency in the same exact artist studio in Krems that I was at, I had a lovely time there. I finished a piece and I showed it, and it was very helpful to have the ability to soak myself in Austrian culture as part of the developmental experience. So.
And while you were over there, we had 2 of Alien Productions here. If you some of you will remember, when they had that event at the Symphony in the Barn, and it was called the Well-Tempered Kitchen. Remember? Yes.
They were cooking food.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, one was cooking food.
Oh,
yeah.
Alien Productions.
Yes,
Yeah.
Because because the next step that happened, when they went back, there was one exhibition then in Vienna that incorporated your work as well as their work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Claudia.
I believe that art has always been based in nature. Like if you look at the earliest cave paintings, it's all based in nature. So I have kind of a dystopian maybe or an abstract question. Can any of you artists imagine art that is completely disconnected from nature? Could you imagine, like visualize yourself creating a piece that's totally trying to disconnect from nature? Is there a possibility to do that?
Yes and no.
The question, I mean, the title of this talk, what's art got to do with it? That really got me thinking that, and this is just really what I would like to say, and it relates a bit to what you're saying. A lot of people don't know this, but in art history, people, the idea of art, or the word art, originated in ancient Greece. So they had what was called the 7 liberal arts. I have them written down just in case I don't remember them all. Arithmetic, logic, geometry, music, astronomy, rhetoric, and grammar. So that was what was called art. And what it was.
Where does hot glue fit in?
Huh? Yeah, hot glue comes later. And the reason why it was called art is because it was something that involved a mental process, but also had sort of parameters, right? Like all those disciplines have rules that you have to work within. So music was considered the highest art because not only was it immaterial, but it evoked emotions in you. So it wasn't until the Renaissance that painting was included as an art, because the artists used perspective. And so that took that kind of thought process and planning that it took for for these other disciplines. So really in art history, and it's in J.W. Jansen, the most used art history textbook in university courses. He writes that in there. And it's like, to me, when I started at OCAD, I was still into drawing pretty ladies, with flowing gowns. I was very much a pre-Raphaelite. That was my aesthetic, and I just got woken up by taking one of Richard Hill's courses, that he made it like a sense of urgency to learn, that artists need to learn about the new technology, because if artists aren't going to be involved with it, it could become something very inhuman. And so, and it was interesting because, you know, Richard Hill had all these ideas, and Norman embodied those ideas, you know, like as being someone who was very humanistic, but also could show you how to design your own circuit board. And so he was really the real true combination of that. So so that's, you know, he ended up doing something completely you never thought you were going to do. I never thought I was going to be learning how to build a computer when I went to art college, but it seemed at the time the right thing to do. And looking back at the Renaissance artists who, like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, who were not just involved in painting, they were also involved in designing machinery and writing poetry and, you know, meant several things. So that's what when we talked about those interdisciplinary activities, it's like, you know, we wanted to be Renaissance people in that sense. So I'm just saying art and nature, to me, or culture, nature, art is something, yes, you can look at nature and see something beautiful, but art in the definition, you know, that we have of it through history, it is something completely that is a human activity. And I think the one thing that we all share, I think, is idealism. You know, we were very idealistic at the time that we could have an influence, a humanizing influence on technology. And one of my friends, Ted Nelson, he'd call it the techies and the fluffies, right? Like you can't, you know, it's not good. You can't just have techies in charge of the technologies. You have to have the fluffies knowing, you know, how it works and what they can do with it. So
it was fascinating. The ancient Greeks considered grammar as an art. I love that idea.
Yeah.
That's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. So I mean, that would be literature, and then say rhetoric, speaking would be where it gets involved with theater.
But this was also in the 80s, where at the art school there was like Luddites, right? And at the time, and they were really anti-technology, and they wanted just their paintings, just their sculpture, just that. And I remember this one time me and Norm had to do a demonstration on how a computer works, right? Like to a board, and I covered it in expanding foam, and we had like incense burners, so it looked like it was on fire. We brought them, they're already horrified to begin with. Like, here, have this, you know. Did a little demo, and, you know.
Did we convince them?
They ran. It was a difficult time.
I want to bring Geoffrey in on this too, because he and 4 others started up an organization called Toronto Community Videotext.
Yeah.
And that became Interaxis at time, which is one of the very important artist-run centers that deals with telecommunications. Do you want to talk about that, Geoffrey, a little bit?
Well, that was coming out at the same time. Like I was doing that online computer graphics is what it was, pre-internet, sending computer graphics over phone lines, and that's when I got hired by Richard to join Photoelectric. But it was, you know, it was kind of similar sort of impetus of trying to wrestle the technology away from the technologists and hijacking a corporate system and a government system, because like Teledown and Videotext was all corporate and government, and trying to upend it a little bit anarchistic, I think. And I think that instinct carries on. It's a little bit unnerving to see how stuff like videotext and phone line communication sort of evolved into the internet, which seemed for a brief moment like it was going to be anarchistic and upending as well, and then has totally, you know, spun on a dime and turned into this massively oppressive infrastructure hanging over all of us. So I guess, is that optimism, were you describing the optimism, the idealism of the technology artists in the 80s, does that still exist? I'm getting a sense that there's like a increasing pessimism and
Well, I think it changed a lot.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
when we could open up our Apple computer and stick in
Exactly.
new cards, and we could program. Like I used to write programs that involved poetry, and it's like now you can't, you know, unless you are a computer scientist, you don't generally write your own code. But we were doing that in those days.
It came with
Yeah.
the schematics, like
Yeah,
huge
yeah,
schematics, and
yeah.
then slowly they got rid of
It's-
that, and then they put special screws in. If
Yeah.
you unscrew it, it's void.
You know,
of
guaranteed
warranty.
void. Yeah,
You have to, you know, it's all about money then. Yeah.
But you can still do code using Arduinos, which is sort of the new thing of
Yeah.
the last 10 years,
Yeah.
right? So you don't have to do much soldering anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you can buy these things for $25. And, but you know, always have to upload code to it, and you can get free code online and learn to change a few numbers to change sequences or duration or whatever. But so it's very close to what you're talking about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But now it's more readily, much cheaper and easier to use actually than in those days.
I spent
That's true.
$1,000 on my first
Yeah.
motherboard. Gold sockets, slim disk drive.
You painted over it. If
Oh,
I
that's
remember.
right. Yeah, I did. To color code all the chips, RAM, ROM.
She painted on her chips. I
I
want to,
still have it.
with regard to this idealism thing, one of the statements that is on, I think the invitation is a statement by Marshall McLuhan, artist, what you can get away with. I'm troubled by that because it makes artists seem like they're kind of finagling and pulling wool over somebody's eyes, and that's not the case. I mean, in many cases, the work that we put into this, only about 10% of it has ever hit the art galleries, and there's a huge amount of work that still lies kind of in boxes and in crates and stuff like that, that is very hard to get that into the public eye. And it's not like, oh wait, it's a gimmick. Oh, you got a gimmick now, you can make a lot of money, you can impress a lot of people. It doesn't work that way. Because a lot of people, when they think that way, kind of dismiss it as being a cheap route. And in fact, it's a huge amount of work, it's a large amount of study and research, and quite often it leads nowhere. And so to say that art is what you can get away with really troubles me.
That's more of a con artist.
But I think
say.
there's a different. I think McLuhan might have had a different approach to
Yes,
the use of those words, and I think what he
Yeah.
probably was suggesting is that artists get to define their own agenda. It's not like you have to sign up and say, okay, I'm going to be a biologist, I'm going to be an engineer, I'm going to be a whatever. It's that you get to say, I'm going to go into a field that I don't know what that field is. I'm going to invent the field as I go. I'm going to pursue excellence in this field, and I have nobody to. I don't have to be accountable to anyone but myself.
Mhm.
It's still pursuit of excellence.
True.
Like 40 years ago, I've seen that on TV, a guy who was talking about his art, and he had made two pieces. One was a wooden beam with one nail. It was called Piece 1 or whatever. The other one had two nails. It was called Sculpture 2 or whatever. And they interviewed him, and he took Marshall McLuhan to a completely different level because he said, I just come up with some utter bullshit and people are bowing to me and throwing thousands and tens of thousands of dollars at me. And I just, no matter how ridiculous it is, he said, just look at these two stupid pieces, a beam and a nail, 30 grand, with two nails, 35 grand. People are stupid, he said. And he said that in the interview on TV. I can't remember his name. So I think he took Marshall McLuhan to the negative end of the spectrum. It was unbelievable, and he just got more famous for his idiocy.
Well, a lot of artists employ irony.
That seemed to be ironic.
Yeah,
It
and a
seemed to
lot
be
of
a
artists
really
charge
arrogant prick
high
now.
prices.
Yeah.
Yes. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
You know, it really is a puzzle. I mean, the way I see it, you're best off in this world as an artist if you're also a bit of a business person as well. If you've got that side, those skills, because then you can create your art, and then you can also find ways to market it. So I'm not very good at marketing, but I tend to focus all my time on my art. But it's a funny thing, isn't it, how some works of art are very, very valuable and others are less valuable, and it's really very hard to say why that is. So that's one of the things that we struggle with, I guess.
And it is when art gets treated as a commodity, right? And it's not defined, necessarily by excellence. It's who knows whom, It's a few influential, people. It's the auction houses, you name it. The price is relative. And when you look at the artists themselves, I'm thinking of Gerhard Richter, so his gallery sold the piece, let's say for $200,000, maybe got $100,000, right? And then, 5 years later, it's $3 million, and then that person sells it back again, and then it gets auctioned off and it becomes $8 million. This has nothing to do with the artist anymore. And as Richter said, I want my work to be accessible and affordable. So he created this series, and he said to his galleries, he said, well, that should go for whatever, $1,200. So they said, we can't do that. We can't sell it for that price. But as I said, this is not us here, right? This is
The art world's complicated like that, and its brand name
this
is
is
really.
marketing. This is economic. It's the value is so relative. It's just it's defined, by some structures that we have no control over.
Getting back to the process, forgetting about the monetary stuff for a minute, there's some really great stories that I would like to tell. One, Doug Beck, for his graduating, by the way, Doug Beck, it's too bad he couldn't be here, but he's one of the great contemporary electronic and computing video artists. Anyway, Doug's in his final year, he had to produce a final work, and it was electronic, and it was to happen at one of the buildings adjoining OCA, as it was said in those days. One of those brick buildings. Had to blacken all the windows with black paper because it required darkness, and he was working on this thing furiously all night, and as time went on, it was burning out. Things were getting worse and worse until finally, by daylight, and he hadn't slept for like 48 hours. He's a wreck, and he decided, well, the best thing he can do is sweep up all the wire clippings and all the junk that had accumulated on the floor, and then maybe have a cigarette. Well, he's sweeping the thing, and while he's doing that, he pokes with a broom handle a hole in the black paper. And he said, oh man, this is going from bad to worse. And he sits down on the floor, pulls out his cigarettes, and he lights it up, and he's puffing away, and he's looking at the opposite wall. And there, on the wall, is a car going by upside down, an image thereof. He had created...
He thought it was hallucinating.
Yeah.
What is the name for
Camera.
that?
Camera obscura.
Yeah,
Yeah.
camera obscura. He had created, it's not a new idea, but it's still a very potent idea. So he said, that's it. That's the work. He took all the junk out, and then people were coming to him at the opening. Nice work, Doug. It was beautiful.
Classic.
But he's very good at thinking on his feet, of taking a disaster and turning it around and turning it into something fantastic.
I taught classes with Doug, and I was always nervous because Doug would never prepare for a class, and here I was at home like doing notes and and I just walk in, and everything was cool. Like Doug, just you were a student of Doug's as well, but yeah, I love Doug's attitude, the way he's able to approach life and the art.
You pass the door beyond which he's having his class, and constantly hearing peals of laughter coming from the students.
Yeah.
He was not
He had a
only
way
a
of
great
inspiring
teacher, he was a
people.
great stand-up
Yeah.
comedian as well. Because a lot of what this stuff was about was the social.
Hmm.
The social thing was critical. If you had and this is where Richard was really good at pushing. What are the social impact? What are the cultural impacts that this technology is going to have? And it wasn't just about promoting technology. That was not the point. It was like critiquing it. Where is it going wrong? Where is it going right? And what are the things we can do to ease it more in the right direction and less in the wrong direction?
Well, what would the wrong direction be?
Well, you see it these days very much, where people are sitting 10 feet from each other, are texting each other.
Right.
Or worse, and just general isolation through technology. So, this is where artists maybe can show us the craziness of what we're doing somehow.
That reminds me, Norman, when we were preparing, Richard Hill used to organize these conferences called Computer Culture.
Mhm.
In the little room off near the entrance, I have a bunch of documentation from those conferences and from art shows and things that we did back then. But I remember we were preparing, and we would go all sorts of places. And one of the places was like Peter or John Street or somewhere in that area of Toronto. And we went there, and these guys, it was the first time I ever saw a video of the Don Valley Parkway. This is like 1980, and it totally freaked me out. Like, we were just freaked out about this. God, you can see people coming out of the parking lot of the Bell Building going on to the Don Valley Parkway. And it was shocking.
I think it freaked you out, but not me.
Well, I don't know. It was.
She still hasn't recovered.
No, it was. No, it was, and now that's so ordinary.
Yeah.
You can't lay charges against, people if you don't have a video of the, assault or whatever anymore. You see, like there's just a lot has changed. And I think at the time, it almost felt like a great responsibility to know the technology and really know it. Like, you use a computer completely with a different feeling if you know what's going on inside. And so we knew what was going on inside. And so you just approached it with a different manner, and from having either built it yourself or put it, take.
I think another important aspect of that then, more maybe than now, is recycled parts and
Yes.
use. That's when active surplus was vibrant and 2 or 3
Right.
floors. And nowadays it's hard to find used things. You almost have to buy everything new, it seems. So
That's right.
and Doug had a class, I think, on reclaiming technology, where part of the class was taking apart a printer, taking out printers and taking all the wheels and guts and everything out and making art with what was left over. I think that's disappearing somewhat now.
The other thing Doug used to do, he didn't like the classroom as a physical space. So he'd take students down to the donut shop. And they all eat donuts and drink coffee and just chill out. And then talk technology in that context. Because he found that the people were more likely to talk and have more of a free flow of ideas in a donut shop than in a classroom.
Well, Norman explored that too with some of his classes in his course called, what was it called?
Mechanics is a cultural
Thank you.
resource.
Mechanics as a cultural resource. We went to Niagara Falls, where we were amazed by the torrents of water going over. I mean, anybody can see them, and I'd seen them before, but it was really great to look at them through the lens of things like ideas like chaos theory and some of the ideas that we've been discussing on the drive down there. And then we also went to Black Creek Pioneer Village, didn't we? Or was that, was that another class?
Yeah, that was another
Butter
class.
churning.
Why did we do that?
Well, the mill there with all the...
Oh yeah, why did we do that? Yes, exactly
Well, you've got
why.
that's right. It was the
Because
huge,
Norm wanted to go.
but you've got that huge, that's right, the mechanism inside
Yeah,
the mill.
yeah, I
That was what
remember
it was.
that.
The gears, the wooden gears and everything. That's right.
And also that the temple of
Masonic temple.
the Masonic
Yeah,
temple
yeah.
with a tapestry that predated Salvatore Dali by 100 years that was full of this metaphysical imagery. I wanted people to see that as well.
I think I would
Ye
say
old
that.
or ye new?
Well,
Sorry, that's how we define stuff. Ye old, ye new.
there's an amazing series of furniture that was made for Marie Antoinette. And it's all inlaid, like beautiful polished woods. It's great craftsmanship, and it's inlaid with mother of pearls. It's really, really artistic. And it has all these little levers and little buttons and little things that you turn, and then these secret cabinets would open up, or an extra part of the desk would come out to give you an extra surface. I don't know if any of you had seen that Museum of Modern Art in New York City. They have a whole exhibition on the furniture. It's just fantastic. And like 200 years, 300 years later, this stuff still works. You pull this little lever and the whole desk just changes. It's just fantastic. And I think that's where art and practicality and craft become one, and that just fascinates me, where you can really not draw the lines out. That's just a piece of craftsmanship. It's not art or something like that.
And we're big on impracticality as well.
Pardon?
Impracticality.
Where's the
Opposite of practicality.
Yeah, but where's that in that furniture?
IKEA.
For repairing toasters.
As an example, well,
Helpless robot.
The helpless robot,
the
yeah.
arm wrestling machine is pretty impractical.
I thought you were pointing out the impracticality of that furniture.
No,
I
no.
misunderstood. Sorry.
No, just that really draws us as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is the great ironies, and I mean, in a society where everybody is always got to be more practical, got to be more efficient. We're efficiency crazy,
Yeah.
and nobody really knows what efficiency is, because what seems to be efficient within one context, in a larger context, could be very inefficient in the sense of using up resources and creating pollution and all that sort of thing.
That's right, and the beautiful time we're saving with all this efficiency, we spend in front of one or the other screen instead of doing something.
That's right.
So Norman, after what, 45 years of teaching, how long was it?
Pardon
How
me?
long were you in the classroom? 45 years?
40, yeah, from 78 to 16. What is that? 22 and 16.
So what was
38 years.
what was your impression of the students? Did you see a transition? Was there a change, or that's quite a span to?
And remember, some are still here.
Both Ryerson and OCAD had fantastic. I mean, they affected me. They socialized me before I started teaching. I was into the aesthetics of logic, this kind of thing. This is built in '76. There's a stochastic principle there, but there's not much of humanity in that thing. It's almost like a logical exercise. But as soon as I, in '78, started teaching at the college, then my art started to get more concerned with human interaction and so forth.
And did it did that vibe continue all the way through?
Yeah, pretty. Every year more. The only problem with teaching is you start worrying more about your students' work than your own, and I was finding I was doing less and less of my own work and more helping students figure out their own. But that's my choice. I don't regret it. Just to get away from this subject for a minute, because it's getting tedious. One of the things I like about Laura's point of view is she would talk about how she preferred bank machines to those dehumanizing tellers. So you can take it both. You can take it both ways, you know.
And also when you talked about Doug's, camera obscura, made me think Caroline Langell showing at Oliver Kellhammer's Eye Review Gallery. Do you know that story? It's pretty good. Well, she set up a mechanical work there, right? And it's on the subway station in Toronto, very popular, and it was a very unique gallery space. Gordon showed there.
Union Station.
Yeah, Union Station. So she sets up the show and she decides, oh, doesn't look quite right, I'm gonna paint the room. And then she put her running shoes and an Honest Ed bag there on the floor.
Well, she went to go have lunch or
She
something.
went to have lunch, and then the Globe and Mail reviewer came and loved the show. The symbolism of where the shoes pointed and wrote this long essay how great the show was. And I love things like that. So it's another example of how, you know, a reviewer is ready to see art. Oh, this is art. Oh, I love this piece, you know? And then, you know, do your number.
But thank God it was a positive review.
I know if she had the robot, it wouldn't be. Yeah, it was wild.
Jim, tell us some more people that came to your Subtle Technologies. There was one Russian woman who specialized in telepathy, right?
Wow,
That was the one year when we were there with Gabriel, yeah.
that was one of the first
That was
ones, I
brilliant,
think.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, didn't you know she was into telepathy?
No, that was why she was there.
I don't think so. Yeah, that was the same year we had a physicist talking about teleportation, quantum teleportation. You know, the idea that you can take a particle in space, and if the two particles have been matched together, if you flip one particle, the one here will flip at the same time, which is, you know, it still amazes me. And now they're using that aspect in encryption, and they'll be using it in the future for quantum computers and all kinds of things. So it's interesting, yeah, to have a physicist there talking about this magical quantum physics at the same time as there's a woman who's talking about telepathy, and it sort of makes, you know, that woman seem, you know, maybe more mainstream than when there's a physicist talking about the same ideas. But yeah, we have really interesting people coming through all the time. I was just telling Sandor about a physicist who many years ago, again, was one of these people I had to kind of drag out of the lab, but I got him there, and this guy named Steve Morris, maybe some of you know him. He's become famous because he's the icicle scientist. He knows more about icicles than anyone else in the world. He builds machines in his lab that creates icicles. One of the things that he's really interested in is the fact that icicles have a ripple in. You ever look closely at an icicle? And scientists to this day do not know why this ripple has a certain frequency, there's a certain distance between each ripple. And so anyway, he studies this, but since that first time that he came to the festival, he's become like a huge fan of the art world. Now one thing I did is I organized workshops which Sandor took in his laboratory, so brought scientists into his lab, and he explores emergent behavior, not just in icicles, but in sand ripples, and how hexagons form in these salt flats and things like that. So really amazing guy who studies patterns of nature. But so yeah, since then now he's become an artist. He's taking images of his work, putting them up in galleries, and so yeah, there's all kinds of interesting stories of how scientists came through subtle technologies and totally transformed their lives, and now instead of going to just science conferences, they're going to art conferences and things like that. And that, for me, that was really an exciting part of that whole world, is seeing these shifts in people's perspectives. And also I think it works the other way, like a lot of artists would come and meet scientists there, and then they'd go off and do work with the scientists and explore ideas with the scientists and make connections and things like that. So I think it's really important in that way to foster these connections between people.
I don't know if Exploratorium still does that, but we were there for one of those, and it was also with artists and scientists.
That's in San Francisco?
That's right.
Right.
So you'd be building something, and a scientist would go by, and he'd go, "Have you ever tried wing nuts?" And, and then that was it. And then so you get this input from scientists like randomly, but it's true. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, I think it's we have the luxury as artists not to have to follow some of the strict regimes that they have to in order to prove their work and reproduce it and so on. But yeah, I think it's fascinating to get these folks together.
Science is becoming so much more political too. Who's getting what grant and what price do they have to pay for getting that grant, and how they have to adjust what they actually find out in their science. So the person who pays for it is police and all that stuff. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah,
Really
it's so
hates
true.
science.
Yeah.
I could point out that Wendy here is just finishing up her MFA at OCAD, and I don't know, did you have to do an ethics review?
No, they waived it. They said
They
it's
waived
okay.
it.
It's
Okay.
okay because I'm.
Lots of the art students have to have an ethics review.
What's
Really?
that
Of-
mean?
There has to be approved by an ethics committee that your
Oh,
work is not
oh.
unethical.
Is it ethical or not?
Oh, the content of the.
Yeah.
Oh, there could be cultural appropriation, like doing yoga.
I think the worry with mine was because I'm biometrically connecting people to the piece, and so they thought that I might be, and I was gonna do it. I was gonna do questionnaires and stuff. So I threw out the questionnaires, and it's all just subjective, and so it's fine.
Interesting.
So you're talking about like your final thesis work? Is that what gets the ethics review normally, or?
Yeah, I think it's the because if you're doing anything where you're doing testing on humans,
Right.
and because the school is a lot more, it's so different from what it was like back before. I was there in the the early 90s, but it's changed so completely, and now it's all everything is. I don't know. It's just a lot.
Well, it became a
more
university.
corporate-
That's one of the
yeah.
things. I
Corporate
think.
office.
Once it changed to university, things really shifted a lot. What was it called?
OCAD now? Is
Yeah.
it?
I think
College
they're
university.
trying to be more like science, I think they're trying to be more like science. I think they're trying to legitimize themselves by being more beneficial to society.
Well,
So
yeah,
it's
it's
sure-
about
sure
time. It's too late now.
Anna, you should talk a little bit more about your poetry and how you wrote poetry for the computer and what you would see on the screen when this was working.
Yeah, I think I would preface talking about that with saying that it was really an interesting time when we knew a computer was just a tool, but how the heck are we going to make art with it? Or, what is that art going to look like? And also, there were a lot of ideas that there was, full of ideas. And I was saying to someone earlier, it's like we knew there was going to be Windows one day, but no one had actually produced them. But the idea of Windows. So then we'd make art. Several people would make art with windows overlapping each other with, different poems or something on them. And it was interesting because we were virtual reality. Graham Smith made a helmet where he had little tiny video cameras looking out and little tiny screens so you could see them with your own eyes. It was just like we wanted that stuff so badly, that we wanted those ideas to be manifested so much. So the challenge was, yes, I had a very traditional art training before I went. And then it's like, what kind of art am I going to make with this? And where is the art in this? And so I got very interested in the structure, how the structure of the information was of interest, because now the structure could be completely different. You can read something, a book, when it's going to end, but now you can look at something on a screen and you don't necessarily know when it's going to end. So I started working a lot with words and different structures of presenting poems. And so I made sculptural things, but I also, I thought too with programming, I just thought programming I think would go along with, the eighth liberal art, because there is an art to writing programs. And so I just figured out, I just started writing programs in BASIC on the Apple II. They weren't complicated code, but displaying words. And I wrote an interactive program, which it was really funny because there was this really experienced software writer, and he was like, what? Like, just because, I'd have them input something, and then, later on they would ask a question about what they answered, and they thought it was really smart, but actually it was really, really silly print, and silly basic programming. It wasn't sophisticated at all. It was very simple, but it was the ideas that you brought to it that made it seem more complex. And yeah, so that's what I ended up doing. Was a lot of it had to do with intonation that you could create. So if you're reading a poem on a page, you could read it, you could have different intonation, it means something different. So I try to include the intonation in the poem, like words going slow or words going fast or words morphing into other words and things like that. So that's what I ended up doing in terms of, art.
Does that work still exist?
Huh? Actually, I can't find the disc. The last time I showed
Floppy
it,
disk.
yeah, the last time I showed it was here in 1999, and I remember this little boy pulling the floppy disk out of the disc reader. I do have it in print though. I did print it out, so I just found it. Yeah, or the
source code.
So when I was going through my big box, in which I sorted out some things that are in the front of the art gallery, there's a poem that got printed in a magazine. That's my program. They print the program in them. So, but it was a big question: what art are we going to do with this? And some people it meant computer graphics. And Richard Hill would say, well, that's a Renaissance idea of what art is, like he was saying, well, we come to art with our notions of what art is. And so, you're trying to make you're working and when you're working with the actual soldering and the designing of the circuit board, that is, Laura's work really spoke about that, then that brings you that becomes part of, the end message. And same with Sandor, his circuitry is beautiful. It looks like Celtic knot designs. It's gorgeous. So there is an aesthetic there, but it's also smart. And it's also teaching us something about logic and about how information travels. So there's this, I guess with the title of this talk, I kind of got like, what's art got to do with it other than thinking of Tina Turner? But it was, but it made, that's because I thought, good, we're back to wrestling with that question again, because we really wrestled with that question back then.
But it was also the golden time to be there. Like couldn't have been more ripe in everything. Like everything was effervescent all around. Like all topics, all new media, all access to technology in Toronto was the best place to be for that.
Yeah.
It was affordable. And you could do so much with it. And and the students, I mean, hello.
Yeah, and it was at that time, when it was started, the only program of its kind in the world in an art college that was teaching artists how to actually build their own machines.
To be fair,
yes.
Painters who came out of OCAD in the same era said it was the best era ever at OCAD.
Right. It was.
There was like a lot of good stuff happening in the city, and
it was a good era.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's also an affordable city to live in. Where now, how much is like rent? Sorry, it's not friendly to live there.
I want to get away from this tedious subject. And talk about what you said Sandor built, which I liked a lot. And it was an early work, and it was a large, old-fashioned tape recorder, 1/4-inch tape, that rode up and down on this column like this on tracks.
Oh yeah.
And it had used the rollers of the tape recorder to pull itself up. Now, of course, the rollers would normally be strong enough because they're not that, they're just little bitty rollers. So Sandor had to counterbalance this thing with big lead weights that were so that the thing was like perfectly in balance.
Mm.
Sometimes he would have to add a penny or something like that, or take a penny away in order to get that balance just exactly. And at that point, the rollers could actually crawl up the tape, and as it was crawling up the tape, it would play the tape. So the tape was stationary, but the tape recorder moved.
Mhm.
And when Sandor came to me with this project, I said, Sandor, it's a great idea, but it'll never work. It'll never work.
That's true,
You got to think of something else.
I-
But Sandor persisted, and it worked.
It worked.
Yeah, we're like,
It's
good
really
luck,
wrong.
Sandor. Yeah, good
It
luck.
also had it was actually a tape loop, right?
Mhm.
And there's a bicycle brake. So when the tape recorder would fall to the bottom, and then it would trigger
A little switch.
a switch, whatever, and then that would cause the bicycle brake to clamp on the tape loop. So then the capstan rollers would then bring the tape
Pull it
recorder
back
back
up
up and
again.
then switch when it gets to the top and release the bicycle brake, which meant it would come down again.
That's right. Good for you. That's great.
And it was shown at the German Art Club.
We had it
Yeah.
here. That's right.
Beautiful.
And
So
you
I-
might say, why is that art? And it's art because it's so improbable. So it goes against all the laws of physics that you normally think of, you know. But
Well, I
it's
didn't-
really perfectly in tune with physics, or it wouldn't work.
Well, I did a test. I'll never forget. I was on the kitchen floor at my home in Toronto. I put the tape recorder on a skateboard, and I had the tape. I was holding onto the tape. So this is the part where the tape is stationary and the tape recorder.
Horizontal.
So it's horizontal, but I just wanted to see if it could pull itself along as the tape recorder is playing back the tape. So Norman is talking about the capstan and pinch roller that play the tape across the tape heads that play back the sound. So I was holding on to the tape, and we're talking about that old-fashioned quarter-inch reel-to-reel tape, holding onto it, and the tape recorder was actually able to move towards me on the skateboard. So at that point, I realized that I probably was going to be able to pull it off. So I was happy about that. I'll just say that piece, the aesthetics in it, in other words, where the art resided in that piece for me was in the idea of a concept. So I characterized it as conceptual art, and I learned about conceptual art from Norman and other teachers at OCAD. It's where the actual physical existence of the piece is all very interesting and nice, but really the purpose of the art is to get across an idea. And for me, that piece, the idea was this, the idea of things that move at different rates, that go in and out of phase with each other. And in that case, you had the loop going around and around. That was one cycle. And the tape recorder going up and down, that was another cycle. And they weren't synchronized with each other, so that the tape recorder would be traveling up, but it wouldn't always be playing back the same segment of tape, because it would be going up and playing back one segment, but the next time around when it was traveling up, the tape loop would be oriented differently, and so that the tape recorder would play back something else. So it was the concept that was the piece in the piece.
Why didn't you explain that to us, Gordon?
Pardon me?
Why didn't you explain that to us? That sounds like the most important
That's
part.
what he said.
We didn't give him a chance to. I mean,
The
I was so impressed.
point is
They
that
finished
it's a
it.
sound
They
sculpture,
said
actually.
Yeah, so a sculpture that
it
makes
fits in
sound.
with that genre.
That's right.
Which is called sound art and sound sculpture.
Yeah, that's right. It did. Yes, that's sound sculpture. Yeah.
But it's also about repurposing a piece of equipment.
Yeah,
To
my
behave
dad's
differently
dad's
than it
old
was
tape
designed
recorder.
to do.
What?
Repurposing a piece of equipment to do something different than it was designed to do.
I feel that's something we're always doing as electronicers. Every time you call somebody for a part, it's like, why do you really want to do that? Like, it's just,
Repurposing.
yeah, repurposing. They
Yeah.
just can't figure it out. Like,
Mhm.
I forget what it was I was buying. Something at Long and McQuaid the other day. He said, well, why do you want to do that? Well, because I want to build a wall full of vibrators so that somebody can stand up against it and feel the motion of a dancer standing in front of them. It's like, wow, that's really cool. Yeah, so it's interesting how we totally mess up with salespeople all the time.
It's a question, yeah.
What's art got to do with AI? I mean, where does John Connor come into all this?
John Connor.
Terminator.
From the Terminator.
Oh, from the Terminator, right.
Well, he was governor of California, I think, at one point, right? Wasn't
Who are we talking about?
he? AI, the John Connor?
Arnie?
Oh, I thought it was John. Oh, never mind.
I think it's a ripe area for artists to work in, personally, AI. I haven't done, I just actually in the last couple of weeks I've been trying to teach myself some deep learning skills, which is, you know, now becoming accessible to artists. Like it was before very inaccessible, but Google has open sourced their AI system. There's a couple of other great open source ones, but I think it's definitely fodder or interesting work that I think artists could get into.
Do you all know what we mean by open source? Yeah, okay.
What about artificial intelligence? Isn't that oxymoron, or am I wrong? No.
Well, I think it's not an oxymoron.
No?
Like, I think that, I think AI is badly named.
Yes.
Just like I think
that's what
virtual
I mean.
reality is
That's what I
badly
mean.
named.
I
Thank
read
you.
that book, Artificial
Save me.
Life by Levi.
But it is a field of study, and it's a field of examining ways that knowledge or information gets processed or generated or evolved or used. And it's kind of new, and I think that one of the things that artists are good at is dealing with stuff that people don't really understand. Like, once the thing has been defined as a problem, then the engineers can get on it. But first it has to be recognized that it is a thing. And I think artists deal with stuff that nobody even knows it's there, and they start manipulating it and pushing around and maybe taking pictures and making objects, and then go, hey, guess what? There's a thing here. And then other people jump on and say, oh, well, that's a problem that needs solving, or that's a,
Right.
you know,
So the
a
creativity
dollar that
factor.
needs earning. But artists just
creativity, yeah,
recognize
yeah.
stuff that nobody else really recognizes is there, I think. So AI is a question. Artists are good with questions. I think that's...
The way I would approach it is this, like, people say, well, they look at, say, armor or something, and why is that art? And I would turn around and I would say, okay, there's a rectangular object with paint on it that represents a bunch of apples and a banana or something. Why is that art? And there's two kinds of answers, or maybe three answers, if you bring in Marshall McLuhan's thing, because you can get away with it. But we'll put that out aside for a moment. The one answer is, well, it's well known that this tradition of smearing paint on a rectangular object and hanging it on the wall has a long history, and is by sheer fact that it's been accepted over many hundreds of years as art, that makes it art. And that kind of is what I consider the more shallow response. A deeper response is saying it's art, that painting is art because it calls to question what our existence is like. What are the forces in our existence? Leonardo da Vinci would paint paintings, drawings of old men and so forth. And you watch how they're, with age, the face kind of caves in. And he's very interested in the forces of nature, not just as an image, but what lay behind the image, the clouds, the water, all those things. Those forces were important to him. So by doing these studies, he was looking something deeper than just the image, but the things that enliven and confound our world, and the things that Sandor was just talking about, the out-of-phase rhythms that create chaos out of simple patterns. That's the deeper answer, and when you come up with that answer, then I can say, well, that's exactly what we're doing with electronics. That is exactly the whole point. We have that in common. It's not about the medium itself, it's the questions that are being asked within whatever medium we choose to use.
That reminds me of a very early work of Anna's. I think it was at the Computer Culture 1981 show. and this was before she started working with poetry, I think. It was a very simple piece, but I love it for its simplicity. So a computer running a very simple program. So in basic programming language, you've got your line numbers, and then you've got, for each line number, like you go 10, and then you've got the line of code that gets executed, and then the next line of code that gets executed, it's got like a 20 or something like that, and then you've got that line of code. And maybe 30, line 30, well, you often would skip, 10, 20, 30, because then you could come up with other lines in between if you wanted to, like a 25 or something. But line 30, that might be go to line 10. And so then the idea is that the program loops. So, because it gets down to 30 and then it goes back up to 10 and then it gets down to 30 again and then it goes back up. So Anna's piece was, because you can also have a line number 0. You're allowed to have a 0. You don't have to start with 1, you can have 0. So the program she wrote was 0, go to 0. So there's one line of code that executes, and it goes back, and then it executes again, and then it goes back. And the thing is that you don't see anything, but the thing is that if you're aware of these things, that computer is working like the blazes to continue executing that program endlessly. And so there's the excitement factor of the fact that it's doing something. You could probably speak on it better than I could.
I just remember, I think Carl's response was, "Oh, it's the thought that counts."
And that's where the idea of
Carl wanted to be here, but
conceptual art comes in. So it was a conceptual piece. It was the thought.
No, because that's what I was saying before. When you know what's going on in the machine, what the different parts and pieces and how they work together, and you know that there's a signal being sent to the keyboard. Did anyone press anything? And it's doing that all the time. And so the computer's working really hard, but you can just have it do nothing, and it's still working really hard.
Machine code would be no up, no up, no up, no up, no up, no up. And then you'd see it.
I'd like to hear more. Norman's been very good at getting everybody to talk about their contributions, but I'd like to hear more about his, since he was the pioneer. I don't know very much. Can anybody elaborate, or maybe he wants to?
Norm wants to.
Well, I'm uncomfortable with the word pioneer, because there were a lot of people working these technologies when I was starting up in the 60s and 70s. The musicians were, in a lot of cases, spearheading the whole electronic art thing, because there was MIDI. Well, MIDI didn't come out yet, but there were still synthesizers and stuff like that were creating music using electronics and everything. So the musicians were really at the real pioneers. I always considered myself a tinkerer. I prefer that to pioneer, but you don't get much creds for tinkerer. But nevertheless, that's more what I feel comfortable with.
And he was one of the rare teachers who wouldn't say, like, what has art got to do with it? Like, ever. Because what happened, I actually had a teacher in OCA, unnamed, that always said, why is it art? And you're like, well, what do you mean? In a technology, and you're like, what do you mean, why is it an art? Can I try first, and then we can decide later if it's art? But Norman always was like totally hands-on, like has all the supplies for all kinds of projects. Very organized, and with human analogies, which was so different than a technical school, right? Like, would just do the old bathwater trick, This is like for electrons, right? But it was made it so easy in one way to understand, but then to apply. So I think that was also a huge difference with Norm as a teacher compared to others out here.
And I'll just step in and say, Norm is one of his many lovely qualities is that he's modest. So I hope he won't mind if I just say that his piece called Ménage, what was the year on that piece?
74?
Okay, so Menage was a piece that, from what I recall, it screwed into the ceiling, and there were 3 electronic devices that traveled along rails. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but so they traveled along rails, and occasionally they'd bump into each other, and then they'd move away and try again, or go in a different direction. And there are those who believe that that is a very important piece, because while other artists were working with electronics and they were even making devices that could respond in various ways to the world, Menage, on some very good authority, was the first piece in the world that had these devices that interacted with one another. So he is formative in that way. His work is formative in that way.
There's one really good piece by Norman that I like that combines visual arts with electronics. That's what there's this painting, maybe you want to talk about it, Norm, where his window opens up and an eyeball comes out and looks at the audience right out of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
It was a really
About
old
that
work
piece?
that I made a painting back in the days when I was a painter of a still life, not a really still life, but a person sitting at a table having a cup of coffee. But it's done so sloppily and so vaguely that I've had people say, "Oh, it looks like a sailboat." But for me, it's a person. It's like really obviously there, but okay, some people can't see the image as a person. But anyway, I had this. I really liked this painting, and at a certain point, I had this idea of surveillance being incorporated into this painting. So I cut a hole just exactly where the eye of the person was, and I built a mechanism so at random intervals this little hole would open up, and in place would come this eye. And I got this glass eye from a guy who makes glass eyes in Australia, and I told it was for art, and he had all these extra glass eyes lying around, and so he sent me half a dozen of them, and they're really realistic. So as the thing swings out of the way, this eye comes in, and it has an eyelid that blinks and everything, and it's looking around the gallery, and then it pulls back, and then the thing closes again. Now, the idea behind it is that you stick it on a wall like that, and the wall is intended to be, for most people in a gallery, the wall is the ultimate end of things. Nothing happens beyond the wall other than the outside, birds flying around or whatever, but the wall is the end. So we had to build a special second wall in front of the actual wall, and it had to look like that was the real wall. Because this thing, the mechanism takes up about 6 inches or 8 inches. So we had to create this space. And the whole idea is that the thing that you thought was the real wall is now suddenly there's somebody on the other side of that wall, and they're looking at you. Art that is looking back at you. So it questions the whole nature of the gallery, where you go in and you feel a certain degree of safety, a certain degree of independence and everything. But suddenly this thing opens up and is now looking at you and analyzing you. Unfortunately, it didn't necessarily work very well, because at art gallery openings, people would say, "Hey, stand right here, just wait for it, and then that would open
You know
up.
what? You should have substituted with a real person behind there, and like really freak them out.
So, but every now and then it would happen where the person would walk into the gallery and was not aware that this thing was there, and it would shock them. You know, they get real, and then they'd have to think twice, because to me the art gallery is a very special place. It has its own rules and everything, its own protocols. And this piece challenge those protocols. There's something else going on in the art gallery beside just hanging beautiful stuff. There's some kind of dark thing, perhaps.
What year was it that you did that?
That would have been 85, 86, something like that. Something like that.
Really? I thought you built that when I was already in Canada.
I could be wrong. I'll have to look it up. Might have been 90s. It certainly wasn't later than mid-90s.
I think it was 90, I remember when you
It
built
was-
it. Yeah.
2001, I have it here.
Really?
Right there.
Well, there you go. It was shown in 2001. My memory is playing.
So Norman, I remember there were a couple of years when our teaching schedules aligned, and we used to drive a lot together.
Who? What?
You and me.
Oh,
There were
yeah,
a couple of
we
years
used
we
to
used to
drive
drive a lot together.
Yeah.
And one of the conversations that we had more than once was the concept of bottom up versus top down.
Oh, yeah. Thinking.
Very important.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. I've always been a proponent of bottom-up creativity. Top-down is best illustrated by a story that I can tell you that had to do with an organization called Experiments in Art and Technology, based in New York City. It was the idea of the brainstorm of a guy named Billy Kluver, a friend of Marcel Duchamp, and they had a warehouse space, and the idea was that they would bring engineers and artists together, and the engineers would provide the means to do what the artists conceived. The artists would be purely conceptual people, the engineers would be purely make it work kind of thing. So the story goes, and this is supposedly a true story, there was an artist that said, I want to levitate. I want to lie down and I want to levitate. And then the engineer said, well, yeah, we think we can do that. We can put magnets on your body. And no, I don't want any magnets. You got to think of another way. Okay, well, let's see. Maybe we can have forced air blowing you up and you can levitate on that. No, I don't want any forced air. Just make me levitate. And after a while, the engineer said, no, she's asking the impossible. It goes against all laws of physics. You can't just make somebody levitate like that. And then, so that is what we call top-down thinking. The artist has this concept, and then you look for the means to actually achieve it. You look for the technologies that will let you do it. And usually it's a very expensive process, and one that usually requires tons of grant money and all that sort of thing. You come up with a great concept, and then you got to go hire engineers and get all sorts of fancy equipment to actually do it. Now, bottom up is the other way. You start, okay, here's the active surface. There's some really interesting motors here. There's some interesting little gizmos. I'm not sure what I'm going to use them for, but let's buy them anyway and accumulate all this great junk. And then one day you're looking at a particular motor or a particular item, and then it gives you an idea, or maybe you're messing around with it. Gordon knows this all too well. He turns wires into speakers and things like that, and that probably didn't start as a top-down idea. You were just messing around with stuff, right?
No, it is. I think it was top down.
Lots of money.
Because I always had these long wires, piano wires, and
I wasn't talking about the Aeolian thing. I was talking about.
Yeah, but it's related to that.
Okay, it's related. Okay.
Yeah, because the Aeolian thing is the problem with the Aeolian is it only works when the wind is blowing in the right direction.
Right.
So it might work, given the location, it might work 30% of the time, 50% of the time, probably not more than that. So I was constantly thinking, how can I do something about, so that I can have something happening 24 hours a day, and then when the wind does blow, that masks over whatever is happening the rest of the time.
Right.
So I had seen an artist using motors before to reproduce audio. So I, just by chance, happened to have a motor that had very low impedance that I could put 3 together to add up to 8 ohms, which is typically the impedance of a loudspeaker, so that I could hook them up to speaker output of an amp and drive them, and that worked. So I've been refining that over the last 10 years or so. I've recently found some bigger motors that will do it.
So is the motor, normally the motor turns one way like that, but these are going like that.
Yeah, they're shaking.
And the frequency of the shaking creates the sound of the.
Yeah, it reproduces the audio that's sent into it.
Okay. Well, okay, so I was wrong. It's not top down, but that's pretty close to
It took me
bottom
a
up.
long time to.
That's a high.
Anyway, so
Combination.
bottom up, you start with the stuff, and then it gives you ideas, and you build the concept up. And the beauty of bottom up is it's quite often you have the stuff already, so it doesn't cost anything extra. And the second thing is you've invested time and into learning how stuff works. You don't hand it off to an engineer, you figure it out yourself at whatever level of technology involvement you're comfortable with. You don't have to be a rocket scientist, maybe just know how a motor works. Or a simple chip called the 555. There's millions of things you can do with that chip the minute you understand how it works. And Laura's a great example of that. She's built hundreds of works based on
No, 555.
555.
At least.
And so that's bottom up. And it's cheap and it's direct and you have total control. You're not dependent on somebody else building something for you. So that's what we always pushed at OCAD was the bottom up.
I never heard that term though, bottom up, top down. I always knew of the concept, but not the term.
Well, in a way, I think you need to work both ways.
Yeah, I think you do. I think you're right.
Because there's practicalities to both approaches.
Well, these long drives back and forth were,
Yeah,
were
it's
really
good.
debates.
It's good
Right.
talk.
Right,
Hard
wasn't
Because
decided.
Sometimes it can't be helped that it's top down, because you have this great idea and you don't have to stop, so you just have to go, you know, that route.
Well, and
I
other
found-
sorry.
Sorry, I found that there was a time when I would just work on the thing and try and do it and discover things, and you do discover things that way. But I later found that the best ideas I had were things I thought about for a really long time, for many years, before I actually figured out how to actually solve the problem. So, you know, you're tinkering all that time, but you constantly have this idea in the back of your mind,
Outcome.
Yeah.
how am I gonna do that? And then it could take you 5 or 10 or 15 years before you actually set about to do it.
Yeah.
So it's both ways.
Yeah, it's not like I never do top down.
Yeah.
It's just that it's the preference, I suppose. I mean, I think I mentioned this in my last talk with the movie, so those of you who've heard this before, forgive me, but to me, a great example of bottom up is Doug Back's stick piece. Did anybody here remember me talking about that? Yeah, he got these motors
Oh,
from
yeah,
Active Surplus that appeared to have no torque, because the motor would start turning this way, and then he'd grab the shaft and it would go the other way, and he'd grab the shaft and it'd go the other way.
No resistance. They would bang into each other. And
Oh yeah, not there yet.
Oh.
So here's this motor that is like got no willpower. The minute you resist it, it said, "Oh, excuse me, I'll go the other way." So he's trying to figure out how can I use this stupid motor to do something interesting. And then he stuck a chopstick at right angles to the motor shaft. He glued it probably with hot glue or something. And he had a whole matrix of these things, of 4x4, and they would all turn and they'd bang into each other. And the minute they banged into each other, both the motors would go the other way. They'd bang into other neighbors, and the whole thing would be like kind of chaotic. This is all about chaos theory, because each motor had a very precise way it worked, but you put them together, created a semblance of randomness, which wasn't really random, it was chaotic. And then eventually, over time, the sticks would find a situation where they no longer banged into each other. They'd just barely miss each other, but they'd sink themselves into a steady state where they no longer banged into each other. And that is, in chaos theory, is called an attractor. And they would get into an attractor and they would stay that way indefinitely until you stuck your finger somewhere in the mix, interrupted one of the sticks. The stick would then bang into another stick and it would all go chaotic again. Now, it might take 2 minutes to find a new attractor, or 2 hours, or 2 days. You never knew. But eventually, it would get into a steady state again. And this piece is one of my very favorite electronic pieces. It shows chaos and the evolution of chaos in a very graphic way. But there's no electronics. There's no computer. It's just Doug's brilliant mind taking something that he didn't understand and transforming it into something fantastic. And he tells me this story where he had it shown in Vancouver, and he heard these two engineers discussing the piece, and one of them say, well, there's some pretty sophisticated computing going on here. And it wasn't the case, It was pure bottom-up thinking, starting with materials, what kind of, what can I do with this motor that it has no willpower?
One problem is,
Sorry, just the question that I know I've seen the piece, but I can't quite remember why the motors.
Were they
They
separated
need a
without a
capacitor.
capacitor with?
Oh, they
They didn't-
didn't have a capacitor?
No.
Okay.
So
They're
they're
AC.
He didn't know that they
AC
needed
motors?
this additional component
Right.
in order to give them
AC
willpower.
motors? AC?
Yeah, it's AC, but there's
Yeah.
3 wires depending on you hook it up one way, the motor turns this way.
Right.
Hook it up a different way, the motor turns the other way.
What were they for originally?
Well, you probably see them in a lot of tape recorders and stuff like that. Yeah.
I smell another top-down idea.
I was just going to say one issue with bottom-up for artists is it's hard to get grants to apply for bottom-up ideas. It's hard to get a grant saying, well, I just want to go and play with something.
But not impossible.
Not impossible, but I'm just saying it's a challenge to write a grant for that.
Yes. I think we are coming to an end. I'm sure we'll continue in an hour. Well, we have the next shows to prepare, and we have to get everything else. Thank you all for coming, and it was so Norman, because we recorded it. Is everyone fine that we recorded it? It's a little late, but because it's being used in April, right?
Yes.
At the Harbourfront Center.
Yes, there's a show coming up at the end of April. I think it's April 28th, but no. Sorry, 26th, 27th, and 28th, 3 days. Digifest is called.
Oh, okay.
And it's happening in the Chorus Center on the Distillery District in Toronto.
Right.
It's not just my work, there's a whole bunch of stuff going
Yes.
on, but I have 3 pieces
Right.
on display, and they're giving me an award for, here's that word again, pioneer. Yeah,
But they wanted to then use that video.
that tape,
right?
yeah. Do I have to get
Release.
people releases?
My people will talk to your people.
I'm sure it's fine.
Okay, good.
Everyone who has a problem, raise your hand.
Yeah, let me know.
Okay.
Thank you all
No
for coming.
takers.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Mark.